Make sure you check out our online store where we work with our graphic designer to create stunning garment and product designs that feature a wide variety of aircraft types such as British fighters, World War II aircraft, American bombers, Russian fighters and much more. You can pick your favourite designs and personalise any items within our Redbubble store that range from clothing right the way through to stationery. All of our designs feature our logo so you can show your support for the channel while getting a quality product. You can head to our website aircrewinterview.tv and click store, or go to redbubble.com/people/AC interview. Thank you and enjoy.
I'm a little different, I think, than a lot of guys that went into aviation and into fighters. Most guys that end up in this line of work wanted to be fighter pilots from the time they were 5, 6, 7 years old. I wasn't like that. Despite the fact that my father was in the Air Force, he was a career Air Force officer, he never maneuvered me in that direction. He never pressed me in that direction. And quite honestly, as I was growing up, getting out of high school, I hadn't the faintest idea what I wanted to do. I went to university, and one of the things that was playing on my mind was playing Major League Baseball.
Oh wow!
But I figured out very, very early in that process that I wasn't anywhere near good enough to do that. So I went to university. I got into the Reserve Officer Training Corps program at the University of South Carolina. I did a number of military courses, and part of that was light aircraft flying. So I actually got my private pilot's license while I was in university, and that's about the time I started thinking about aviation for real.
Yeah.
So I took the Air Force qualification test, which was a real bitch, but I passed it, and I got a pilot training slot, and I think the urge and the motivation grew from that point on. Mm-hmm. So I was a late comer to aviation. I was a late aficionado, but it caught on and it did pretty well for me.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what aircraft did you start training on when you joined the U.S. Air Force?
The Air Force training program is 53 weeks, a year of 53 weeks, and it's nicely tailored to build up to high performance aircraft. The first one is basically a Cessna 172, which the Air Force designates a T-41.
Sounds cooler.
Yeah, and that airplane is there for attrition. It's there to determine those people who will never fly. They either don't have the aptitude or the desire, or some of them find out that they're simply terrified when they go up to fly. And that airplane is one that you weed out the folks that aren't going to make it. You go through that, and then you move into a subsonic jet, T-37, which was euphemistically known as the Tweet. Because of the noise it made. It's a high-pitched, awful whine. It's not something that's nice to listen to, but it's a great airplane for intermediate pilot training because it's 2 engines, no reheat, no afterburner, but it's fully acrobatic. It does all the things that a frontline fighter will do, albeit not nearly as well, but it gets you used to it. And after about 4 months of T-37 time, then you go into an airplane that will always be near and dear to my heart, the T-38, which is known as the White Rocket.
It's a beautiful aircraft.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful airplane. Supersonic, reheats, afterburners. It does most anything. It for a while held the speed record until the F-4 moved back in and took it away. But it was a beautiful, beautiful airplane to learn on. It was sleek and sexy, and it was a great learning tool, if you will.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
So, at this point in your training, did you know what aircraft you wanted to go on to? Did you have a choice?
I knew it was fighters. I knew it had to be fighters, and I plugged for that from day one in pilot training. I figured if I'm going to do this, I don't want to fly a mini motor. I don't want to drive something from point A to point B. I want to do something exciting. So it was always a matter of looking for and trying to get to the point where I could end up with a fighter. The F-4 came about simply because the way the assignment system worked is when you graduated from pilot training, there were, I think, 52 of us that graduated, 70 odd that started. But what the Air Force does is it brought down what they called a block of aircraft, one aircraft for each graduate.
Right, right.
If you graduated number one, you went into the boss's office, he had all the airplanes up on a blackboard, you picked the one you wanted. Wow. If you graduated number last, you got the only one that hadn't been picked yet. So our class had not a lot of fighters. We had one F-105 and we had, I think, 12, maybe 14 F-4s. And fortunately, I finished high enough in the class that I could go in there and point at an F-4 and say, "That's what I want, boss." And
that must have felt cool.
That's what I got.
So how long did your training take before you got posted to the Phantom?
Not very long, actually. I graduated from pilot training in May, and I went to what they call a replacement training unit, the RTU, in I think it was July or August. Now, at that time, the Vietnam War was raging, and they were pumping people in like there was no tomorrow, so there weren't any delays. I went right straight into F-4 training at MacDill Air Force Base near Tampa in Florida. Did about 4 or 5 months of that, and then straight across the water after a couple of survival schools.
That's great. I mean, compared to today's systems, it's you know, it's like that, isn't it, when you go through?
Oh, I know. I think people today, unfortunately, are delayed and delayed and delayed. It's a shame, because once you graduate, you're pumped up and you want to go.
You want to go, yeah.
And do it.
So, Steve, what were your first thoughts on the F-4 Phantom?
Mean, aggressive, an airplane that looked like it meant business. There's absolutely no doubt about it. It was something to behold, and very, very impressive. And of course, the Phantom at the time was the airplane for the USAF and for the world, really. So it was something that got your heart beating if you wanted to be a fighter pilot.
So what was the role of the Phantom when you joined?
Well, the reason the Phantom has been around as long as it has been, and it's only just phased out in some countries, it's still being flown by a few, is the fact that it's versatile. It does everything. It was an excellent air-to-air machine. It did conventional bombing, which is mostly what I did in Southeast Asia. It carried a nuclear load when it needed to, and it did virtually everything you'd ask an airplane to do. So obviously, I was in training to go to Southeast Asia, and that was going to be conventional bombs and weapons, that type of thing. And that's what we focused the training on, with a fair amount of air-to-air, because there were MiGs over there, and something you needed to be concerned about. So we kind of mixed the training between conventional ground and air-to-air.
Mm-hmm. So what squadron do you start your training on?
F-4 training was the 94th Squadron at MacDill Air Force Base, famous old squadron from World War I, the Hat in the Ring Squadron. And yeah, that was 4 or 5 months of that, and then on off to Southeast Asia.
So let's talk a bit about your ground training. What was it like coming from, you know, like the T-38 and the other aircraft you flew? What was that like?
It was, well, it was difficult. I mean, there was a lot to learn, most of which revolved around the weapons system. Obviously, the training aircraft didn't do any of that kind of thing, so you didn't have to worry about it. We spent an awful lot of time learning about the weaponry, the bombs, the bullets, the rockets, the gun, and how to employ those things. And of course, we put that into practice in the air at MacDill.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about your first flight. What was that like, and can you remember it?
Yeah. The first flight in the F-4 was pretty special. I mean, the T-38 was a special airplane. It was a high-performance airplane, but it was kind of a sports car of the skies. It was small and sleek and all the rest of it. The F-4 was big and noisy and powerful, And the kick in the butt when you plugged in the afterburners was really something to behold. And it was an impressive airplane from day one.
So could you tell the difference, like, you know, obviously the T-38 had reheat, but could you tell the difference going on to the Phantom? That
Oh yeah, yeah. The reheat in the T-38 was very smooth and very controlled, and you put it up there and you felt the push, and it did a nice job of that. The Phantom just kicked you in the ass, and it really, you could really tell the power that was in those J79 engines when you kicked in the afterburner.
And before we move on, like, what actual model were you flying? Was it the C or the D, or?
The RTUs, the 94 Squadron, all the RTUs had E models in '69. It was the hard wing E, but it was the E model with the integral gun, and I didn't get into the D model until I got into combat, and that was a D model at Uban. But yeah, the training aircraft, even as early as '69, were in the brand spanking new shiny E models.
Wow, brilliant. So let's talk about how the aircraft handled and what were its strengths and weaknesses.
Right. Well, strengths were power, the ability to work in the vertical with the power the aircraft had. The weaknesses were, well, there weren't many, but the ones that were weak were terrifying. In essence, probably the thing that I most remember, most F-4 guys will remember, is a feature called adverse yaw.
Yeah.
And adverse yaw occurs when you are pulling G, you've loaded up the airplane, you're pulling hard on the airplane, and because of the way the airplane's designed, if you do what you would expect to do in an airplane and throw the stick over to the right with G on it to turn, the airplane's going to snap to the left, and it's going to give you the ride of your life. If you're lucky enough not to spin, you'll live through it and you never do that again. But it's a real attention getter. So we had to learn, and we got pretty good at it. You had to learn if the airplane was loaded up, if you were max performing, max maneuvering, you turned with the rudder. You kept the stick centered, you stomped on the rudder, and the airplane turned like airplanes do.
So let's talk about DACT or ACM. How did that fare, you know, against the types at the time, the Phantom?
In initial training, and this is one of the shortcomings we had early in the Southeast Asia War, in initial training we didn't have any dissimilar training. We were F-4 against F-4, so what you had was like airplane, and the pilot that thought better and moved better won the day. DACT didn't start to come in until a little bit later on, when the powers that be figured out we were not doing as well as we should have been against light wing loaded hard maneuvering MiGs. So people started thinking about, well, maybe we ought to do a lot more of our training against airplanes like this, smaller, more maneuverable, maybe less powerful.
Exactly. So let's talk about your first frontline squadron, and obviously you've mentioned it there, but going into combat, what was that like? Yeah,
the first, my squadron at Uban in Thailand was the 435th, the Eagle Squadron. We had 4 squadrons of F-4s at Uban, and what was it like? It was going to war the first time, and it was a real baptism of fire. I mean, we weren't, when I was over there, we weren't going into North Vietnam. There was a bombing pause, so we weren't going up to Hanoi, Haiphong, as some of the earlier guys had done. But we were doing most of our work in Laos, where the Ho Chi Minh Trail came down from North Vietnam, down through Laos and into South Vietnam, delivering goods and services and people. And our job was to try and stop them. This went on 24 hours a day. It went on 365 days a year. It involved hundreds and hundreds of airplanes of different types, tankers, fighters, FACs, SAR airplanes, you name it. The war was full on in the air, and for a 24-year-old guy flying a hot fighter, it was about the best thing you could be doing with your clothes on.
So you weren't terrified at all?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Oh, you
there,
were,
there
right.
were. Oh yeah, there were moments like that, and then anybody who tells you there weren't is lying to you. But you know, you're trained to the point where you kind of overcome that. You do what you need to do. And if you're terrified, you think about it a little bit later when you're back in the bar.
Yeah. Was the Phantom the right aircraft for this role?
I think it was. Yeah, it was capable of carrying an awful lot of iron. It did a great job of bombing, which is what we were doing the interdiction role. It was good air to air when it needed to be, and I hasten to add it didn't need to be when I was there because the MiGs weren't coming over to Laos, and that's where I was. But it was a very capable airplane. It lent itself, as the war went on, to precision-guided munitions that they brought in, and that kind of thing folded into it. Like I said, very, very versatile aircraft, a jack of all trades.
So, for some of our more geeky viewers, what kind of weapons would you be carrying?
Most of the time, dumb bombs, 500-pounders, 750-pounders. We carried a lot of cluster bombs, CBUs, that split from a canister type of thing and spread little golf ball size things around for people to step on or whatever. We used them a lot against anti-aircraft sites because they covered a fairly wide area, and it was a pretty good way of getting even when guys were shooting at you. So CBUs were good.
So did you ever get up close with a MiG?
Later, not in Southeast Asia, during training, and I'll be happy to talk about that, but the MiGs at the time, they weren't coming across the North Vietnamese border into Laos, so we didn't see them. We heard from them. Our airborne command and control would call them out every now and then because we're on the North Vietnam side, and they'd feint in our direction, then they'd turn around and go back. Never saw one up there, so unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I never got to tie one up with a MiG.
So Steve, do you have any memorable stories you can share with us on your time on the Phantom?
Oh,
I'm sure you
well,
have
let's see.
plenty.
12 years and 2,200 hours. Spent a lot of time on the Phantom, so there were, there were lots of things. But I'll have to say, and one of the reasons that I wrote the book was because what I did in the Phantom primarily was nothing any different from what hundreds of other guys did in the Phantom. I had my moments. I had good missions. I had missions that weren't so good. I never had to step over the side. Basically, during the whole tour, I suppose the things that I did that were a little different was I spent 6 months in Iran training the Imperial Iranian Air Force in DACT, Dissimilar Air Combat Tactics. They put together a team, an American team of F-4, a couple of F-4 pilots, one F-4 backseater, a couple of F-5 pilots, and a tactical radar controller who sat on the ground and orchestrated things in the air. And we went over to a place called Cherokee in southeast Iran and spent 6 months there training their hand-picked pilots, F-4 and F-5 pilots, how to go against each other and how to develop a program and a good syllabus and a good training program. It was a super experience. It was really great. It's a shame they're no longer on our side, but there you go.
So, what were the Iranian pilots like? Were they easy to work with? Were they good pilots?
They were an interesting crowd to work with because of their culture, for a couple of reasons. The Middle East and the Far East, there's a concept called saving face, and that's difficult to work around if you work under an American culture, as I did. I'm used to flying a mission with guys, a training mission, coming back down, and very bluntly debriefing it. If the guy screwed up, I'd tell him so in no uncertain terms. If you did that with an Iranian, in no uncertain terms, he would switch off. He would turn his brain off. He'd look out the window. He was not going to lose face because you were debriefing him. So we had to learn very quickly that the way to debrief the Iranians was very, very different from the way we debrief our own. So if an Iranian screwed up, you would have to kind of take the approach that, well, what you did was all right, Ahmed, but you've got to understand that the intent here is for you not to fly out in front of the guy that you're fighting with so he can shoot you down. If you say it nicely like that, he would nod his head and he'd take that on board. Whether you learned anything or not, I don't know.
Was that frustrating for you, like in the debrief?
It was.
You get straight to the point, yeah.
Yeah, it was. But it's, you know, it was their ball game. They were paying for us. So we were the folks that were providing the service. Additionally, the other thing that we found very interesting was the political climate. And at the time, the Shah was doing great things for the Iranian people. He was bringing them into the, at that point, the 20th century. But he was on a knife edge. There were an awful lot of people that wanted him gone. There were an awful lot of people that didn't like what he was doing. There were an awful lot of folks that wanted to remain in the Stone Age, where a lot of them were. And in essence, he had to control his activities with an iron fist. Consequently, he farmed out a lot of people in different walks of life that were there to make sure that everybody was going in the right direction. In the fighter business, they had there was an organization called the SAVAK, which was the Shah's secret police, basically.
Oh, wow.
And it was rumored, although nobody ever said so, that every squadron had at least one member of the SAVAK, qualified pilot, guy that did the job, but he was there kind of to look over everybody's shoulder.
Really?
And make sure they weren't saying the wrong things and make sure they weren't going in the wrong direction. So this was a challenge because a lot of their brighter fighter pilots, and there were a lot of them, they had some great ideas. They, like American fighter pilots, Russian fighter pilots, anybody else, they had great ideas, and they would suggest, if they could, they would suggest, well, why don't we do it this way or that way or the other way? But they couldn't, because any kind of independent thinking was kind of looked at as a little bit of a deviation, and they called attention to themselves. So if you were talking to one of these guys one-on-one and there was nobody else around, he might give out to you and he might talk about these kind of things, but any other Iranians around, they were straight down the line.
Wow,
yeah.
That's really strange. That must be really frustrating for you. I can imagine, yeah.
It was very, very strange, but again, it's something we learned to live with, and we understood why, and we knew that that they couldn't afford to step out of line.
But, you mentioned you went to the weapons school earlier, so
yeah.
Tell us about that and how you got into that program.
Well, that's an interesting story. The weapons school, just to give you a little preface, is the Air Force Weapons School. It's not the Top Gun, not the movie version, but the Air Force Weapons School is probably the top and most challenging training program, aviation training program in the world. It's also the most prestigious. If you come out the other end of it, you are afforded a certain amount of respect because you have been there, and you always wear a patch that shows you've been there. Most everyone wants to go. There are some people who don't want to put in the effort, but most everyone wants to go. And I was an instructor pilot, an F-4 instructor pilot at Homestead near Miami in Florida. And at the time, they came out, as they did, about every 6 months they'd come out and they'd say, we have 6 slots in the next weapons school class. So my boss says, my squadron commander, Dick Fisher, and my operations officer, Duke Terry, decided they'd push me for this job, which I was most grateful for. And the way it worked out, it's kind of a funny story, but there were 2 of us in the wing, another guy a little younger than I was, who was also, he was a very talented guy, but we were kind of competing for this.
Right.
And the way this came out was, my boss and my ops officer and his boss and his ops officer, he's a different squadron, went to the wing commander's office and they sat down with a case of beer and they all talked about, Steve's advantages, why Steve ought to go and why Bill or Bob or Fred or whoever it was ought to go. And this went on for most of the day, fueled by the beer. While we sat around and wondered, who was going to get the nod. Well, I got the nod. I got a call that night from Duke, and I kind of blustered over the phone because I couldn't think of anything to say, but man, was I happy. So I went in the next day and I cornered the two of them and I said, you know, thanks so much for pushing me. I do appreciate it. I said, which of my many talents won me the job? And Dick Fisher laughed at me. He said, you're old. And I said, I'm old? I haven't hit 30 yet. He said, well, he said, it's relative. And what happens is, to get into the weapons school, there was a cutoff date, so many years as a rated pilot. I was rapidly approaching that point, 7 years rated. And the other guy was a couple years behind me. And he said, I managed to sell the wing commander on the fact that you needed to do this right now. He could do it later.
Wow.
Boom.
You were in.
Take it the way I can get it.
So it must have been a lot of hard work, though.
It was, yeah. The weapons school was the toughest 6 months of my life. Mm-hmm. And, but tough, I say yes, but rewarding also. Mm-hmm. And the academic program, once again, we got a little bit of it when we went to replacement training union. We went into the nuts and bolts of it and very, very deep into the weapons and tactics at the weapons school. 6 months, half a day of academics, half a day of flying, and it was unrelenting. You know, it never backed off, never eased off. You never got much time to take a deep breath and enjoy it.
So heads in the books all the time.
Heads in the books, or in the cockpit. And the flying, albeit the best flying in the world, training flying, I think, at Nellis out of Las Vegas and northern Nevada. The flying was just as difficult, and the stress level was just as high. Mm-hmm. Now, I alluded to the one instance out there that I consider probably the peak of my training career. We had been in academics looking at Soviet equipment, Soviet aircraft, MiG-21s, MiG-17s, 19s, that kind of thing, in depth. What do they do? What are they good at? What are they bad at? What are their strengths and weaknesses, and so on and so forth? And you know, it was a good academic program. Well, the boss called us all in. The class called us all in on one late Thursday afternoon, I think it was. We were all bitching and moaning because we'd had a long day and we wanted to go out and have a beer. Yeah. And nevertheless, we sat down in the auditorium. And this guy, he was the operations officer of the weapons school. He got up on the stage. Major Larry Keith was his name. And he had a picture behind him of a MiG-21, a MiG-17. And he said, gentlemen, he said, for the past week, you've been studying the capabilities of these aircraft. You've been involved in what they do and how they do it and how well they do it. And we're all sitting there saying, oh, yeah, okay, come on, we'd like a beer. It's nice time to go to the bar. Yeah, I didn't one of those. And he paused a little bit and he said, starting tomorrow, you will fly against these airplanes.
That must have been a shock.
It was a shock. Jaws hit the floor, the bitching ceased, because none of us had any idea how this could come about, why it was coming about, what the deal was. It turned out that our class, thanks to the efforts of Major Keith and those guys, our class was included in a Department of Defense program called Have Idea. And the Have Idea program was the exploitation of Soviet aircraft. It started out with MiG-21, MiG-17, moved on to 23s later on, and the classification level was open your mouth, yeah, you're out of here, you know, that kind of thing. It was declassified, I hastily point out, in 2006, so I can talk about it now. But in essence, what it was an opportunity for us during our tactical training to fly DACM against MiG-21s, MiG-17s, and glean all the information that you could out of that kind of activity. And we started right off with it. It was great. We would go out, we would brief a mission up to the tactical ranges up north of Las Vegas. We'd head on up there, and at some point, one of them would jump us, or two of them would jump us. And we just tie it up. Standard Nellis rules, you could do pretty much whatever you needed to do in the air, and we had some great missions against the MiGs. We thought about this. Of course, we didn't have a chance to, we briefed them, but we briefed them over the phone, and we wondered who were flying these things.
Yeah, that's
who
a
were
good
flying
point.
these airplanes. And it turned out that they were all Air Force, Navy, Marine fighter pilots that had been secretly recruited. They came to Nellis every morning. Every morning they'd climb on a 727 that took off to the north and went up to the famous Area 51, and it landed there, and all these guys would get out and they'd do their day job flying MiGs. Then in the evening they'd climb back on the 727, come back to Las Vegas and go home, where they couldn't talk to their wives about what they were doing. They couldn't say anything to anybody, but it was the best kept secret I ever saw in the Air Force.
That's amazing.
I never ever saw a word of it slip out. But the training evolved into, we had it the best. We didn't have any sortie limitations. We flew as many as we could during that period of time when they were there. I had 5 or 6, I think, against the MiGs. But the training program evolved into a follow-on program called Constant Peg, where almost all the fighter pilots, well, an awful lot of them anyway, would get one sortie against a MiG at some point in the career, a chance to look at them. Mm-hmm. But we were part of the program. We had the best of it. That was it was the pinnacle of my time in the weapons school, no doubt about it.
And before we wrap up this Phantom part of your interview, how did the actual Phantom fare against the MiGs?
As we learned, it fared better, and this bore itself out. It was borne out in Southeast Asia, because right at first, when we were going north and the MiGs were up, they were kicking our butts pretty good. And that's because, as I mentioned before, basic training, we didn't have any dissimilar. We were all F-4 against F-4. We were used to an airplane that performed the same way ours did. But the first guys to go up, early guys to go up against the MiGs, discovered that they turned better. They did a lot of things that the Phantom was not taking advantage of because we hadn't trained for it.
Yeah.
The dissimilar idea that came out of this, and that also went with the MiGs, is the fact we started realizing that you used your power and your vertical maneuvering, and you could beat this guy, and you could beat him badly. And we started doing that during the latter parts of the war because we had been trained to do that. Our pilots had been trained, and dare I say it, our pilots were better.
Of course.
Of course.
So how many hours did you get on the Phantom, Steve?
I got 2,200 hours on the Phantom in 12 years.
Wow.
And you know, the airline pilots watching this will say, that's not very much. But when you think about it, at about an hour a time, average,
Pretty impressive.
that's a lot of flying.